Long days and pleasant nights, fellow travelers along the path of the beam. I am known in this realm as Jaime and Fuego, and bienvenidos, welcome to the horror show and a special presentation of Hail to Stephen King that is not airing on its typical Sunday slot. Yeah, that's right, because here on November 10th, we are celebrating the 30th anniversary. That's right, man. 3 and a big old donut for none other than possibly one of Stephen King's most controversial works that he has ever done, none other than the Tommyknockers. Once again, Jaime and Fuego. And this is, ironically, for whatever reason, a book that in comments constantly, I thought this book was okay when I finally got around to reading it, which was about 5 years ago, but I saw the miniseries, which was in 1993 on, I believe it was ABC, when I was a kid, and it scared me, but I was 10 years old. It scared me for the sheer fact that there is a near comatose woman, Tommyknockers, knocking at your door, you know, and she's like wrapped up in a straitjacket and, you know, going nutsoid, and, you know, it's about aliens and an entire town being taken over by a presence of a ship when it's being unearthed, but I didn't really gain a full scope of this until not just when I read it for the first time, because when I read it for that first time 5 years ago, it was okay. And I just reread it in the past week because I realized that, hey, it's 30 years and this is a significant one that people still talk about, because it was it was basically after King had done It, okay? And so after It almost felt like, you know, with the re-release of Eyes of the Dragon, because that had technically been written a few years before, and that was like full-on fantasy, and he did another Dark Tower installment, which had like very real-world aspects to it, and fantasy elements and Western elements and stuff like that, mobster elements to some degree, as you guys who have read Drawing of the Three know, all the stuff with Eddie Dean and, you know, Balazar and all that. So it was like King was really, he was at the tail end, first and foremost, in his personal life of probably a decade plus, if not maybe close to 2, of, you know, when people get famous and they have more money and they already like to drink and do drugs and be crazy, you're probably going to have a lot more of that in your life. And so it's notorious with Mr. King in a lot of his documented stuff and interviews that he's done and various other things that about the time he was writing the Tommyknockers and close to finishing it, that his family and a couple friends confronted him with like the trash bag in his office, and they're like, well, here's an empty cocaine vial. Here is, you know, I can't remember if it was like, you know, half-smoked joints or, you know, just empty beer bottles, but there was basically all of these different things that he was consuming on a daily basis at the time. And he had even said in On Writing that he thought he was what's the word I'm looking for? He was like he was managing his alcoholism when he was just not drinking until 5, but, you know, he was like, I was doing other things before then, you know, just to get amped up. And when you think about someone like Hunter S. Thompson, and when you read, if you search on YouTube the daily substance consumption of a Hunter S. Thompson who wrote Fear and Loathing or something like that, thank the Lord King never got to that degree, but even Hunter aged much longer than any of us anticipated and ended up just shooting himself in the head. So all of that's beside the point. The point that I'm trying to make is that Stephen King was at a breaking point in the late 80s after all of just the fanfare and all of the fame that was hitting him, the millions of dollars he was probably making already at that point. And so, yeah, his family was like, we're worried about you. Look at all of this shizzle. What is going on, man? And so a ton of that is reflected in the Tommyknockers. So I'm going to really approach this in a very gingerly manner because of the fact that the Tommyknockers, upon rereading it this past week, I want to love it so, so much. I really don't like the miniseries. After rewatching the miniseries, it changes so much. It's supremely flawed. I'm going to talk about it briefly at the end, but as far as the book goes, this is so borderline to me loving it that it's tough to say that you don't. But in the third act, some of the stuff that happens, it meanders, but at the very core of all of this is a relationship between two people of a similar love and interest in stuff. One is a poet by the name of James Gardner, which just cracks me up because of the fact that, James Garner was Rockford, man, that's right. I mean, one of the best detectives ever, a guy that I watched with my dad in reruns as I was growing up and lots of the TV movies and stuff like that. He was also... he was the original Maverick. The Maverick remake with Mel Gibson. I know nobody is very happy with Gibson and the stuff that he did about a decade or so ago, but I'm kind of ready to forgive him and hope that people make mistakes and act like dumbasses, and if they're talented and you're willing and so on, but that's beside the point. Once again, Guard, as Bobby calls him, which is... Roberta, who is, she's not so much the main character. You think at the onset that she is, because she is a Wild West writer that is living in a place called Haven, Maine, which is even more rural than Derry. So Derry, as all of you know, is the lair of Pennywise and, the evil that he sprung upon that area of Maine and stuff like that, which is basically Bangor. But Haven is... I guess it lives up to its name, at least initially, as a place where people can seek sanctity and privacy, and, that's why she lives there. She inherits some land, and she's just living on this property, which has sprawling acres, and she's writing her Western novels, and she has kind of a back-and-forth relationship / friendship with this guy who she calls Guard, and, Roberta Anderson, he calls her Bobby. So, whereas he says to various people in the book, my friends call me Jim, they are known to one another as Bobby and Guard, and the relationship between the two of them is really the most endearing, tragic, wonderful thing of this entire book. It's what really makes me love the book. It's so much of the other stuff that transpires here that makes me have second thoughts, have reservations and stuff, because so much of the rest of it borrows, and I really hate to say borrows, but it's King expanding on his main universe that he has put together at this time. Because, seriously, you have various references to Johnny Smith from the Dead Zone. You have a reference to a character going to Derry and on like a little trip for goods and stuff when Haven starts having all this stuff go down, and they hear laughing in the sewers. You have references to Ludlow and the Micmacs and stuff, straight up Pet Cemetery. And so King he's drawing from all of these different, aspects of his expanded universe, so to speak. And so as a fan and as somebody who... I hadn't reread this since I was initially going through the King stuff about 5-something years ago, and as you can see, first shelf is the missing slot where, we're talking 87 when this book was written. And so King was still developing a lot of things, especially the Castle Rock universe, and so it was very fulfilling to have those connections and very, very cool. But at the heart of this, despite the fact that it's a woman unearthing, mistakenly, a buried alien ship that's been in the ground of this small Maine town, the woods outside of it, for thousands, tens of thousands, who the hell knows, They make implications, but they never really specifically state how things have been. But they do go to extremely interesting lengths of describing problems that had taken place over generations around this land, from, people just... feeling poisoned and, doing crazy things and so on and so forth. And so that's where I can see, King personally described this as being an awful book. And I think it was awful because of the fact that I assume as a 600-page monster, if he was confronted by friends and family and he had a deadline to hit, maybe half of it was when he was still all effed up, and maybe the other half, or chunks of it, or whatever, were when he was trying to get sober and trying to clean himself up, as he calls it. And so, for that reason, this is, at times, a very, very tough book to read. But that's why I find it so tragically fascinating, because of the fact that Guard is for me, one of the best characters the King has crafted, aside from Larry Underwood in The Stand. I mean, this is a character that he's a failing poet. He has a woman that he used to be deeply in love with, and that there is still a love amongst them, but now it's more so like they're both in their own personal essences of isolation, and one is completely isolated in Bobby as she's in a rural aspect of nowhere just writing her Western novels. And then you've got Guard, who is trying his damnedest to still be a poet, or just hang on the laurels of his older stuff, and just trying to survive without having a real job. He's like trading writing poems for farmers for wood in the winter and stuff, so he can actually have heat in his place. It's crazy. And so he's out on this book tour, and the woman who organized it basically booked him as a last-minute addition because somebody else canceled. She hates him. She's like, "You're a drunk, you're a fool, you're an idiot." And that is really probably one of the biggest aspects of the multi-layered nature of this story, is the fact that Guard is dealing with addiction and trying to get past it and actually trying to kick it, whereas Bobby didn't really have much addiction. And then when she mistakenly trips over this ship with her dog Peter and then decides she has to start digging it up, it was just a piece of metal in the ground. Who the hell knows when you could have kicked it over? She was in a random spot at a random time, but she's in the woods and she knocks into it and she feels the almost radioactive presence of this. And so that's where it gets to, man, when they start digging up this ship, as Guard eventually joins her, and I'm still trying not to spoil that much. He has his problems, she has new emerging problems. He thinks she's in trouble, and so he makes his way down to the rural area of Maine after being on this book tour, or poet tour, I should say, and he decides to help her dig this thing up. Now, the fascinating thing that King factors into this is that all of the radioactivity that starts inducing changes within people, the same sort of radioactivity and almost like nuclear fallout of sorts that Guard is so obsessed with and talks at drunken dinner parties with people with, talking Chernobyl and various other things, and what that sort of exposure does to people. They parallel that with when this ship is being dug up and how it affects the town of Haven. And Guard is unaffected because of the fact that in a ski accident when he was a kid, trying to swoon a girl in his teen years, he smashed into a tree and he has a metal plate in his head. And so, whereas everybody else has, the things that are going down and the changes that they're incurring, the becoming as it's described, which entails, as a matter of fact, in an interesting fashion, becoming very technologically creative, but in an essence naive in a lot of other ways. And so it's a very intriguing dichotomy, but Guard is unaffected. And there's one other character who is unaffected because of a war injury, and that is a man named Ev. I can't remember, it's Ev Hillman, I want to say maybe, but he has a grandson who is into magic, and it's actually in the miniseries one of the few things that I think that they do well. So he asks his son-in-law to get a magic kit, or just some sort of cool present for the kid's birthday, and that actually brings about one of the best adapted beats in the miniseries, I think, of the entire miniseries. But lo and behold, this Ev guy basically, he doesn't so much team up, but he gains just the scent of what's truly transpiring, and he sets some wheels into motion for some investigation, which is cool. So I have to say the biggest difference between the book and the miniseries is the fact of its unflinching brutality, of its scope, especially with, there are so many larger forces that are brought into play in the book, of different government levels, of the national and the secretive level. Minor spoiler, the shop shows up in this, and they have some, not an extensive, heavy-handed introduction, and a lot of people, as you know, might love the Stranger Things, and the fact that, the government agency in Stranger Things is essentially the shop, which you saw in Firestarter and a few others, Golden Years, for instance, the very poorly received Stephen King miniseries, and the ABC Tommyknockers miniseries was similarly poorly received, and with a lot of good reasons. There's a crucial character who's described as being in her 50s who was having an affair with somebody else, who, that story was actually right here well, at least collected here in I Shudder at Your Touch. It was the lead-off story, the revelations of Becca Paulson. The Becca Paulson character is drastically changed in the miniseries, but she has a very similar kind of showing in the book. But nonetheless, the stuff with Becca Paulson and her husband, who is diddling his co-worker, she's described as being in her 50s, but very well aged. And in the miniseries, they change it to former porn star Tracy Lords, who was, she's not that bad in this. She was better in. Oh goodness, she was funnier definitely in Zack and Miri Make a Porno. She was more entertaining in Crybaby. She was okay in Blade, and she's been in lots of other stuff. But who am I to fault somebody who got trapped in Way of Life, or so she says, and whatever. But long story short, I don't want to talk about Tracy Lords in this. I'm going to talk about the fact that they made excessive tonal changes in the ABC miniseries and softened things so significantly. Another significant softening was of the constable of the town, and the fact that this woman, Ruth, she kind of catches wind of things early on, and this is early on in the first few hundred pages of the book, and she does something very drastic and severe about what she knows is going on. And things are... It's more so a love story with her and somebody else in the miniseries, which is kind of off-putting to me. But it's, the seeds of it were sown in the book, and so she's widowed, and that's minor spoiler once again. But the book, it's sci-fi combination along with the horror elements and along with just the scale and the scope of what a sort of radioactive just essence from a ship that has been in the ground and has been wreaking havoc for who knows how long. I mean, it's been messing up people's compasses for hunters, it's been throwing planes off, all of these different things. King really does build an interesting mythology about this particular area of Maine in this book, and so it's also interesting as more of the ship is dug up by Guard and Bobby. His Guard decides, I love this woman, I'm just going to help her out. And they also softened him in the miniseries significantly, at least as far as his alcoholism goes. It's not a bad Jimmy Smits performance. If I have to really give any significant credit to the miniseries, it's the fact that the actress that played Bobby, whose name is eluding me, but also the actor that played Ev, the grandfather of the child who is obsessed with magic and goes into kind of like not so much a comatose state, but he ends up in the hospital. His brother disappears. I'm once again trying not to divulge too much, but Ev is a great actor who I've seen in various other things in the 80s and 90s and stuff like that, and so he also does a great job. But Schmitz really in a lot of ways embodies Guard to me, especially at one particular dinner party incident after a poem reading, which they change some aspects of it. They soften how much his character is struggling, because in the book they make it very apparent that he's on the wagon, he's off the wagon, he's on the wagon, he's off the wagon, where they don't make it seem as bad. And also in the book he's kind of left to not rebel against all the craziness that's ensuing throughout the book. And he's just, Bobby's feeding him booze, and he just keeps digging and helping her out because he loves Bobby. Another contrasting thing amongst the miniseries and the book is that bittersweetness of the love. It's much more a fallen love with a deep, deep friendship in the book. And they, just like with Ruth the Constable, they turn up the melodrama in the miniseries, which is something that in some ways my heart loves, because I'm that hopeless romantic to a really shoddy degree in a lot of ways. But in others, it was so unfaithful to the source material, it didn't epitomize the bittersweetness. And the miniseries makes such drastic changes in the final act when you kind of see how the town reacts and how so many things have gone down. And this is where I want to spoil significantly, but who knows, maybe I will in a few minutes as things go down. But this is a book that I feel like needs to be read, even if King says it's awful, for the sheer fact that aside from the third act where things get really silly with all of the different creations of sorts that the elevated intellects of these people are able to conjure and create and so on and so forth, I feel like the personal stuff and the ebb and flow between Bobby and Guard is so just bittersweetly beautiful, and also the analogies and the comparisons between political things of that nature. In the late 80s, I mean, Iron Curtain was still up, and there was constant fear of the doomsday clock, as they called it, and they even mention it at one point in time in this book, being like 2 minutes from midnight, just like the Iron Maiden song, 2 minutes to midnight, and they're like, the world is about to end. In the 80s, there was so much happiness and silliness and whatever, but there was that constant fear, and they really epitomize it here. And King has always been a very political person. Look at his Twitter for that, unfortunately. And that's not to say I don't disagree with a lot of what he says, but I'm a registered independent, so I don't like talking politics most of the time. But as far as societal issues and stuff like that, this book was so self-reflective, but based on the demons he was dealing with at the time, I can understand why revisiting this story is so flippin' tough for him, man, especially because Guard essentially is King in so many ways, and the self-doubt and the just numbing yourself and all of these other things. Guard is such a fascinating character. He makes the book for me. Him and Bobby's relationship makes the book for me. Despite the differences of how things pan out between him and her in the book and in the miniseries, I definitely prefer the book, even if I saw the miniseries as a 10-year-old and it affected me differently. The Tommyknockers themselves, as they're manifested in different ways in the source material and in the adaptation for screen. I don't want to divulge more. It's interesting how NBC said back in 2013 that they were working on a new adaptation of the Tommyknockers. This is one where, if done well, I would be so for it. I mean, completely and utterly for it. But I still don't think they could go as balls to the wall as they would need to, especially with just the way the emanating presence from the ship, the radiation, as I called it. I mean, we're talking teeth falling out, women needlessly menstruating, collective consciousness, all kinds of craziness. And also people, if being in the town long enough, if they leave, they basically start vomiting and they are on the verge of death. And, same if you haven't been there and you go there, as, the levels had risen. And so it's a very, very intriguing contrast. But, I would still, with the half-heartedness and very PG-ness of the adaptation beforehand. I mean, the fact that where was Altair 4? We're just talking about the shed here and the nastiness that dwelt in Bobby's shed, and anybody who has watched and read knows, or one or the other. That was actually one thing that I thought they did pretty damn good in the miniseries, was at least the design of the shed. But once again, that's it's small and self-encompassing and everything. And why does everything have to be just red glowy lighting? I mean, it was the early 90s. It was 1993. I don't know. There were so many problems with the miniseries. Also, the way that, as they were showing them digging up the ship, it didn't even look so much like a protruding flying saucer as just like, oh, here's like a little kind of pillar stacky rock thing here. And some, I don't know. But I remiss. We're here on November 10th to talk about the Tommyknockers book specifically, and I really like this book, especially upon rereading it. Whereas it was just okay when I read it 5 years ago, rereading it hit me so much harder with the interpersonal relationship of Bobby and Guard. I thought the sci-fi aspects were interesting, especially after rereading Dreamcatcher. Man, holy smokes! This, for another one where he tries to blend in science fiction aspects, this blows that out of the water. The Tommyknockers is, I wouldn't say a King classic, but it is essential King reading, especially for people who don't necessarily like his approach and like the things that he does. Detriments, there's lots of boring, minimal fleshed out characters that you don't really care that much about. But Ev, Hilly, Danny, obviously, Guard and Bobby, there are some characters that you really latch onto and care about. And even, I don't know, even Ruthie, the, lost love from the former, state trooper husband's partner, and even this one guy in particular who, when, it's funny because Guard, when he is digging and Bobby isn't feeling well, there's various different people that come and help him in like fleets and stuff. And there's one in particular that he has kind of a face-off with that, they both have an understanding, and his name is eluding me. But, so, as a whole, it's another one of those bloated, almost 600-page King books where he borrows from certain things he's done before, but yet innovates in other areas and makes it really, really fascinating. So, the ABC miniseries, you can find it for probably under $10 on Amazon or somewhere else, but the 30th anniversary... We're not seeing a 30th anniversary, obviously, of the Tommyknockers being released because of King's thoughts on it, but I really, really like this book. So I think you guys should read it. If you're fans of science fiction, horror, drama, it melds all of those together very, very well. And the miniseries is at least good for the portrayals of Bobby, Ev, and Guard. So, I have been Jaime and Fuego. I extend a grande gracias, and thanks for tuning in on a Friday instead of a Sunday for this special 30th anniversary of the Tommyknockers. You can find me on all social media sectors at Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube with a soon relaunch coming. We have Thor Ragnarok, Justice League, so many fun things that I can't wait to talk with you guys about. Yeah, damn. My band Chiron, my horror metal band that you have seen on the horror show here. That's right, guys. Our debut single, No Hero, is on as a lyric video on the horror show. And yeah, we have an album that we are working on right now. All 13 tracks are released, but it's just as far as the spending and the recording process. And on Sunday the 12th, there is going to be a very fun discussion about Creepshow for its 35th anniversary. Yeah, that awesome anthology that King did. So, once again, long days and pleasant nights to all of you. I hope that we have been well met. Fuego here, and until next time, hasta luego, sin amigos. I am hopeful that it is sooner rather than later, and until next time, remember, stay scared, and read Stephen King, regardless of what you've heard about the Tommyknockers.